My name is Simon Clark. I am the projects manager for the European Geosciences Union. I'm also a science communicator, writer, and educator, which is why I'm talking to you today. My background tends to be in-person science communication through public engagement, such as through science art, recently at a music festival, and also supporting science policy communications, etc. Working for the European Geosciences Union also means I have experience both behind the scenes of a conference, but also my background is as a researcher in climate change, risk, and flooding. So it means I also experience presenting as a scientist from about 10 years worth of research experience. So I'll be bringing all that experience together as we go through this webinar. But before we dive in, I want to quickly note that learning the fundamentals is quite easy. I mean, you can just use it, turn them into a bit of a checklist or something as you go building a presentation. But learning how to make them work for you is a difficult part. We approach presenting differently in terms of style, in terms of what we're comfortable with, what is natural for us. And so making sure that your presentation works for you rather than you working for your presentation is probably one of the key things you need to make sure you do during your talk. And I'll get more into that a bit later in the presentation. One thing to keep in mind for any presentation you do, whether it's oral, it's a poster, or even other types, is you need to keep in mind, what do you want the audience to learn? What is the key message they should be leaving? Many scientists will just go straight in to creating content, excited about what they've done, what they found. But if you're just presenting data or figures, sure, that's great, but what are they taking away from it? Is there a key result? Is there a key message? So always keep that in mind, and always keep it as one message. Everything else should build towards that message. So there's 4 sections. The first and longest is oral presentations. We'll go through that, talk about posters, talk about graphic design for posters and presentations, and oral presentations. And then I'll finish off with some just logistical things to be aware of when you do present, as well as some resources. So before you start building your slides, writing your presentation, first thing you need to do is really think about who your audience is. Ask what is their knowledge level. Everyone there wants to learn something. But if you cater your presentation to a very broad audience, spend a lot of time discussing literature and background, then a lot of scientists in your fields aren't really learning anything. You're talking about stuff they probably already know. So you really want to think, what is the knowledge level, and try and work to that. So there's some examples I thought of. So if you're talking to researchers in the same fields, then you could be quite confident you probably share common concepts. There's a lot of shared knowledge. However, some of the methods you use might be unfamiliar, or if you're developing new methods, they might not know what you're talking about at all. So be sure to be clear and introduce technical specifications in your presentation. You might be also talking to colleagues in a seminar or researchers in a similar field. They might not be familiar with everything in your field, but might know of it. So you want to try and relate to them through cross-cutting themes, maybe shared problems, shared current events even. And again, make sure you define technical terms you're using. But at scientific conferences, it's not just scientists and researchers who are there. It might also get decision makers and media. So these could be policymakers, it could be journalists. So if you want to cater to them, make sure you focus on impact. What is the point of your research in a very kind of practical sense? What you're trying to achieve with it, and make sure you relate it to current events and also what the needs are. They might be looking for example, solutions. So if I need to kind of orient your presentation to something that is more solution driven. Next step, before you make the slides, is really sit back and think about your story or your narrative, because every presentation is a story. And you should approach it as having a beginning and a middle and an ending. And like every story, there's a bit of a journey to that. You start off in a base where people are quite familiar, perhaps, and then you encounter a struggle, an antagonist. And then you finish off overcoming that and saying, perhaps where you're going to go from here, and even summarizing what's changed since that beginning. A general way to break down your presentation in this kind of story format. I think there are 6 sections you can go through. I'll just quickly go through each one. I'll go through each one as if I was presenting a 10-minute presentation, for example. So the first section, the motivation. This could be your research questions. What was the problem? Was there a new insight or discovery that led you to this piece of research? Really try and draw people in with saying, this is what we're trying to address. So it's the motivation, it's the why you're doing this. And I would probably give maybe 1 to 2 slides for this. It doesn't need to be too long, but it needs to be kind of punchy and kind of really emphasize where you're going from, the kind of that baseline. Speaking of baseline, the second section, background, also I think 1 to 2 slides. This focuses on like the who, so who, whose literature are you building your work on? Research doesn't come out of the blue. We're basing our science, basing research on the backs of many, many other people. So don't position yourself as if you just came with all this information out of the blue. Contextualize yourself within that research. This also helps people to become familiar, understand what base you're talking from, because they will also have overlap with you. So you want to identify that overlap and build from there. Next is the method. I would suggest perhaps 2, maybe 3 to 4 slides for this. This is probably one of the most interesting sections, and you want to focus on what you did. I say what you did over how you did, because what focuses more on the kind of clear steps, the discrete actions you took, and how it's perhaps a bit more broader, a bit more loose in terms of the flow. So focus on what you used, what you did, etc. Then move on to the next section, which is results. Again, 3 to 4, I think. You focus on what you got, but don't just present the data and explain it. Also give emphasis to the insights you got. What have you taken from it? Here you can also talk about your experience of discovery. I find a good technique to use during presentations is it's both repetition. So if you have something exciting, repeat it again. That breeds familiarity and adds emphasis. But on top of that, perhaps use an anecdote. It humanizes your story. It kind of makes people relate and be drawn in a bit. So storytelling techniques like that can be useful. An anecdote about discovery, I think, is endearing and interesting. The next section, focus on the future. So what you're going to do. This could be 1 or 2 slides. Again, we're narrowing back down. And focus on perhaps the problems it's brought up, as well as interesting pathways you want to take next. Even if you're not fully sure, including this section invites discussion, right? So one thing I've learned from collaboration, people love to correct. So by presenting the future direction you want to go in, you can like incite people to make a point, make a discussion, which is what you want, right? You want people to collaborate with you to strengthen your research by providing their own insights. And finally, we have summary section. This is where you'll provide a few key highlights of what happened, maybe just one, and maybe that just one is your key take-home message. But note I also highlighted this with an icon of a letter. This is because it also should include contact information. How are people going to reach you afterwards? And that should be there for people to see after you stop talking. So it's easy for them to remember, to write down, to make note of. So again, before you jump into making slides for a oral presentation, work your outline first. You want to have that story, well, then you need to kind of understand how you can fit your research, your work into that story. So how do you do this? Well, I have a three-step way I do it. The first one is very loose. I create some broad sections where I put in related information. So section A, for example, could be about the problems, the research base, perhaps the context, the societal context, current events, all of that's related to it. And then I'll do a second section. I'll make that second section B flow on from A. So there's a nice continuity. But B could be more about, okay, but this is what the method I'm using to try and tackle this issue. This is the analysis I used, these are the results I produced, and so on to section C, which could be more about what you learned, where you're going to take from, what direction you want to go in, etc. So just loose groupings. There's a phrase in writing I often employ a lot, where it's you write first and edit later. So you do these loose groups. Don't worry too much about what it looks like, but just make sure your ideas are down in this nice grouped flow. Then on the second section, the second step, sorry, you want to write down and bullet key points. So you take everything in this section, and then you bullet into the key point and message you want to convey in your presentation related to everything in that section. So maybe you have a key message you want people to take away, want the what key research influenced you, for example. Anything like that, bullet point your points. Those key points must be down in a very clear way for you to understand. And then you take those key points and finally turn them into a slide. So you have one thing you want to say about the research questions. Well, you've made that into your research question slide. What's a key thing you want to say about the background literature using? Well, you turn that into a slide as well. Or there's a key thing about perhaps you want to define a certain concept. Well, that can be a slide too. And it goes on with each section. What is the key highlight from your discussion you want to talk about? Well, turn that into a slide, etc. So loosely group things up. Then for each section, make a key point out of all the information you want to talk about, summarize it in those key points, and then turn each point into its own slide. Speaking of the summary slides, it's a really important slide. It should always be the slide you try to end on, but do not leave it as just a thank you or questions. You want people to still be able to think about what you said, to process what you said, in which case also include 1 to 3 key take-home messages. Make sure they're short. Don't use paragraphs. It's one sentence and it's a short sentence. Less the better. I think 3 is fine. 1 is great. Also acknowledge your contributors and also include your contact details. Again, I mentioned it before. A key point of presenting is growing a network. So include your contact details on that final slide. But also, it doesn't have to be in a final slide. It could be at other points in your presentation too. Maybe include it in the bottom right for every slide you have, so people consistently know how to contact you, and they don't have to worry about trying to lose it if they're writing it down. Orals, please make sure you build it around your time limit, and also account for question time. When a presentation doesn't fit with its time limit, it's quite obvious, and I don't think it looks really professional, and it doesn't really contribute or help support the points you're making. Question time might be included in that time limit and might not be. Check with your organizers always. And do not think that question time is extra time to talk. That question time is discussion time. It's super important. And also, for any kind of talk you do, make sure you're kind of re-going over that overview, re-going over that structure and the message you want to send. The time for different times, different talks work differently in terms of structure, in terms of flow, in terms of emphasis. You can't fit a 50-minute talk into a 10-minute talk. Even just cutting it down, rethink the flow and structure of your presentation. Same thing, you can't fit a 5-minute talk into a 3-minute talk, 30 minutes into 20 minutes. Every time you're presenting in a new time frame, approach that from the beginning in terms of flow, in terms of structure. A note on slides, keep the number of slides small as much as possible. I suggest 1 slide per minute, and this is a general piece of advice you see. However, if your content is quite low on each slide, and each slide is used for emphasis, you could include more, for example. If you want to include an image of a study site, or you want to include a particular graphic that provides an emphasis to your point, that supports a point, you probably don't need to spend 1 minute on that. But always remember the primary function of the slide is a signpost to your audience. It's to highlight to them what you're talking about. If someone loses where they are, then they can go back to your slides and be like, okay, so this is what we're talking about. And as a secondary function, they are your prompts. Don't take your notes on stage, don't take your script on stage, build your script around the slides. So when you're reading through the slides, you can look at it, you can be like, okay, this is what I'm supposed to be taught to at this point, right? But this is the secondary function. Don't try and make all your slides as prompts, because that's a slightly different function than as a signpost to the audience. Always make sure the audience is the people who are being catered to first, but then the slides can support you in your talk. The key thing to take away is your brain uses the same part of itself to process reading as it does listening. So the more text you have, the more information you have on your slides, the more people are not listening to you. Your slides aren't there to stand on its own. They're there to support your voice. So make sure everything you say is there to support your voice, that people aren't stuck reading through perhaps long paragraphs, through lots of labels. Make sure everything is simple and that it supports each point you want to bring up yourself. People should be listening to you and seeing what you say emphasized on the slides. A quick few thoughts on media. In terms of graphics, particularly in figures, I suggest 1 or 2. Infographics, you can probably use a bit more, as they can really help with demonstrating a point. Figures, people need time to process them, to read them. Of course, you can talk people through the figures, but then that takes more time. So perhaps 1 to 2 figures, maybe a bit more if it comes to infographics. With photos, again, perhaps a couple. Make sure they're high resolution. Video photos taken in situ, perhaps at a research center in a lab or something like that, or at a study site, always tend to come out a bit more low resolution. So as an alternative, you can look for open source images online, make sure they have a Creative Commons license so you can use them. But again, don't confuse people. I'd suggest 1 photo per slide, maybe 2 if we're trying to show perhaps a change or a relationship. Again, with videos, I generally avoid them, especially with audio, as they tend to add more complexity than you really want when you're trying to focus on other things. However, GIFs or GIFs tend to work quite well on presentations and PowerPoint. So if you have a video, consider perhaps converting it into a GIF and then including that onto your presentation. The same with equations. Equations, it's not just reading them, which slows the audience down. It's also familiarity. It's also asking people, do you recognize this? The more general the audience, the less equations you want, because the more they perhaps might not understand what you're talking about. And also, similar to technical language, if someone doesn't understand an equation, that can be a block in terms of understanding what you're saying. So yes, they're important, but try and emphasize the key points of an equation rather than throw every part of like a whole section of a model in. Again, use equations as emphasis to demonstrate a point, not just because you want to show all the maths you've done. So that was probably the longest section. I'll now move on to speaking and just give some general advice. Again, a reminder, if you have any questions for me, you can put that in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We'll get back there eventually. Also note that this webinar is being recorded, so this will be uploaded to the EGU YouTube channel in the coming weeks. So, speaking. Before I go into some various tips and obstacles that I have, or I've encountered myself, I just want to highlight that when you speak, you're not just there speaking as a scientist, you're also speaking as a performer, as a communicator. You need to engage the audience. So that means looking at them, be enthusiastic. You need to communicate clearly and effectively. So that means breathing slowly, talking slowly. Also means emphasizing points with graphics, for example. How can you communicate this in the most quickest and effective way, but doesn't lose information? Also make sure that is accessible material. So is your material colorblind friendly, for example? So is your material colorblind friendly? Is your material legible from a distance, for example? If you're presenting virtually, then you can see a projector. Can someone at the back of a room understand what your presentation is? I got a question saying, what do you mean by photos and graphics? I could answer that now. So this is the inclusion of graphics, which is a very broad term, I understand. And this can include things like figures, so scientific figures. It could include things like infographics, so simple images that try and convey a piece of information using text and images, or if you include photos in your oral presentation on your slides, for example. Yeah, and again, yeah, make sure they're accessible. This includes making sure they're high resolution. If they're low resolution, people can't understand what you're saying. One thing to keep in mind is science communication is a skill. So when you're on stage, you should also be invoking skills in the same way you might do when you're writing or when you're coding, for example. This means, again, it could be about talking slowly. It could be gesticulation. It could be using pauses to emphasize what you just said. It could also just making sure the words you use are jargon. It could be using anecdotes. It could be using repetition. It's how you recognize the audience and work to them. But why do I say performer and not just communicator? Well, a performer also, I'd say, is this kind of additional persona you have, which helps you to kind of navigate the engagement space. It helps in one way because I think when people critique you, they critique that performing self, right? It's less personal, it's more about the skills you invoke. And that's good for two ways. One way, I think it provides a slight shield. So if you're someone who gets very nervous, then just think, well, they're critiquing my performance, which is fine because we're scientists. Everything gets critiqued for self-correction, writing, performing, etc. But it also means you have this performance mode you go in where you know this is where you invoke all your science communication skills, so your science communication training, as opposed to outside of it when you're perhaps not engaging with those as much as you might. So I'd also ask, what kind of performer are you? And by this, I don't mean throw in a lot of jokes, be funny, etc. Maybe that works, but everyone communicates differently. For example, I gesticulate a lot, right? And if I try and just kind of remove that and try and manage that gesticulation and stop it, more of my energy is going into managing that gesticulation than it is on focusing on what I'm saying and what I'm saying. In that way, actually, it's better then for me to include gesticulation in my presentation, but kind of be aware of it. And instead of wave my arms around in a way that distracts people, use it to provide emphasis, perhaps, or invoke an idea to kind of perhaps express myself and engage the audience more. So, in a sense, make sure that you're doing performing in a way that is natural to you. This also comes with talking as well, but I'll get onto that next. Yeah, so each presentation, whether it's like a poster or a oral, should come with some talking points prepared. For an oral script, as I said, you should have key bullet points per slide, and you should use that to direct what your script is going to be. For a poster, always have a 1-minute elevator pitch prepared that introduces your idea, the key message, perhaps what's exciting and what you learned from it, and also perhaps the problem as well. Keep it to 1 minute, practice it, and be ready to deliver that when people come talk to you at your poster. However, when I say script, I really do mean just bullet point the points you want to make. Don't write it line by line, because if you memorize it line by line, and then you forget a line, or you stumble over a line when you're presenting, you're more likely to panic, more likely to try and figure out how to get back on that script again. However, if you just learn the key points and then talk through those points naturally, it means you're less likely to panic when you do forget something, because you're not actually forgetting everything. You just need to remember that one point. It also means that you speak more naturally and less robotic, and the more natural your voice is when you talk, the more people, more comfortable it is to listen to, and more comfortable it is for you to speak as well. So, as I just said in the previous slide, you need to make sure your presentation works to you and your style, and this includes how you talk as well. So don't write this script down as some kind of dogma you have to follow. Write the script down as like, okay, these are the key things to hit as I talk. Again, practice, 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 rehearse by yourself out loud to get used to saying what you need to say. Rehearse with colleagues, because then they can provide feedback and also ask you questions you might want to anticipate for your talk. And of course, I think record with video as well, because then you can start picking up little behaviors you might not notice. I'm certainly much more aware of, for example, gesticulation or how fast I might talk when I look back at a video. And practice, it's not just about what you want to say. So, for example, it's not just about content and how you say it, but it's how you want to say it. So that's including practiced speaking slowly, practice slow, deep breaths as you talk, practice pausing to give yourself time to compose yourself and giving time to the audience to reflect. So the talk itself, during it, here's some tips I really advise. First is do not read off your notes, poster, or slides. They're a distraction, and it takes your voice projection away from the audience. So if you're looking at your slides when you're presenting, your voice is now directed at the slides rather than the audience, and it can make it much more difficult to understand you. Also, if you're taking notes up, you always have the urge to check them, which takes you out of your performance mode. I mean, you've done all this research before, you know what you're talking about. You just need to make sure you hit the key points, don't rely on notes, and just practice so you get more confident with speaking without them. So on that side, also do speak slow and breathe slow. I mentioned this a few times now. When you're presenting, speak slow. And when you're speaking slow, speak even slower, right? You'll probably need to speak slower than you think you do in order to convey a message, especially if you're nervous, in which case also breathe slow. Focus on that breathing. It helps calm your nerves, keep you more in the mode. Don't try and just rush through it and get it over with, because then you're kind of going against the main reason you're there, which is to convey a message, which is to connect with people. And I said, face the audience. That's the people you're talking to. They need to hear your voice. Make sure you face them. Don't apologize for nerves. Um, Most people are nervous to some degree. People will probably understand that, but also apologizing just takes up time for you. Don't make it about you personally, make it about you as a performer, as a communicator. Make it about the research, which means being enthusiastic, communicate that excitement. It's great making a discovery. It's great making progress. It's great talking about a subject you're really passionate about. Show that, smile, make eye contact. It can be difficult making eye contact in person. There's so many people, but I do tend to look towards people who perhaps are nodding a bit, etc. They can be helpful to kind of just keep you in place and motivate you along. Um, Again, if you forget something or stutter, don't dwell on it. When I watch someone presenting and they stumble over a word, I don't really think anything of it. It's something people do. So when you stumble over a word, don't worry about it. I also have a habit of speaking quickly. I also have a slight speech impediment. And basically just giving someone compassion to yourself. I mean, it's a big thing you're doing, right? So of course there might be slip-ups, and that's completely fine. And with forgetting things as well, um, you know your mistakes more than anyone else. So if you forget something, you can always just bring it up later. Bring it up at another slide that's related to it, or bring it up in a discussion. A few other points, always use the microphone. It's not just to help people hear you. It's not just about volume. It's also about helping people online here. People need that input to receive audio online, but also for people who use hearing aids, for example, they are often connected to a microphone network. So think about it's not just about being loud. And also take water. It's talking is very drying. Speaking of, timing. I talked about structuring around timing before, but I really want to emphasize when you're speaking, keep to the limit. If you keep talking and you go over, you're eating into other people's presentation time, which communicates that you're not being respectful or considerate of them. If you take up your question time, it shows that or communicates that that perhaps you actually don't care about people's opinions, people's discussion about that scientific collaboration, and you just want to there to talk about yourself. So keep to the time limit, think of other people. If you're having trouble with that, use a timer. A lot of moderators or organizers have their own timer you can use. So ask ahead of the conference or meeting or whatever if they have a timer you can use. Otherwise, ask if you can take, for example, your phone up with you and just use that to time yourself. You might also find that a timer is another distraction. This is another thing where you have to think about what works for you. Maybe a timer helps you keep you in check. Maybe it just adds more nerves. And finally, if we run out of time, don't rush through everything. Don't try and finish all your slides if you've got quite a few left. Instead, focus on making one final point or finishing that final point. And always try and stick your landing. So always finish on the end slide. So focus on delivering those 1 to 3 key messages, focusing on highlighting to people how to contact you. Yes, so after the speaking comes the questions. So just some good practice for answering questions. Firstly, always repeat the question. This communicates your understanding to the person who asked the question. It helps the audience who might not have heard understand what the question was. It also gives you a little bit more time to process what has been asked as well. Be respectful. Um, if you said something and you're not sure if they understood you, don't ask if they understand what you said, because then you're kind of pushing some pressure onto them. If you ask them that and they haven't understood, but they feel worried about perhaps looking stupid or ignorant, then it might not continue the discussion, which is what you want. Instead, just ask, for example, oh, was that clear enough? Have I been clear for you? Make it about your communication rather than putting the pressure on them, because you want to continue the discussion and you want to invite people into your understanding. Again, don't take it personally. Most of the time, when you get an awkward question, which unfortunately does happen, it's usually people who, A, perhaps just aren't that great at communicating, but B, it usually comes from some kind of misapprehension, a misunderstanding, perhaps some assumptions that don't exactly tessellate with what you were saying. And every time someone's asked me an awkward question and I dig into it with them, it just turns out to be something like that. It's never like a personal attack or something. It's just they didn't quite get something and they're just trying to see where it fits with what you said. Also, avoid long one-on-one conversations. Um, this is probably more relevant for orals because there are other people who probably want to ask a question. So, um, sure, have a discussion with someone, but be aware there are other people. So if you think that's taking up too much time, you can just ask, that was a really great question. Thank you. I just want to get some other people always. Otherwise, could we continue discussion afterwards? And be sure to continue that discussion afterwards. You don't want people to be assuming you're just saying that just to get away from a question. So always follow up with people. Um, Another point, if you can't answer a question, a dreaded scenario, what do you do? Well, basically, don't panic. It happens quite often. If you didn't understand, ask again. That's perfectly fine. We're all about clarity and communication. If you can't think of an appropriate answer, as I said, ask them to continue discussion after, but make sure you follow up. If you really don't know, it's fine to acknowledge that. Like we're all learning, we're all pushing the boundaries of knowledge, of understanding. That means there's going to be a lot of stuff we don't know. So acknowledge that and invite people to discuss it later. Especially if we talk about future pathways, we want people to engage with what we're saying. And finally, always ask people to contact you after a talk or a session. It's always a good moment to network, try and catch people and discuss with them. But it's also conferences can be quite busy. People run off to see another talk or something. So trying to emphasize the contact points. And just keep in mind that you're there to share. You're not there to be judged. People in audience, they want to learn. They're not here to kind of undermine you. So keep that in mind to kind of soothe your nerves when you go on stage. So I'm moving on to poster presentations. The biggest point I want to make is to keep them simple. Your poster is your visual abstract. So I'd say don't include your abstract, the presentation abstract in your poster. Instead, use the points made in the abstract to inform its structure. It's also visual, right? So you want to make it attractive people who see it. And the more words there are, the more clutter there is, the more difficult it is for people to engage, to can read through it. So to emphasize, a poster isn't a manuscript. It's not a PowerPoint presentation. It's its own thing and should be treated as such. And realize that people who pass posters, a lot of them don't spend that much time there. We're talking about seconds. So when you design your poster, make sure you do it in a way that catches people's attention. Again, a lot of words everywhere, a lot of text everywhere might not do that, but images can, graphics can, and I'll go into that later in the design section. But how should you structure a poster? A lot of posters follow this, but I will say that poster structures have a lot more fluidity compared to a lot of other presentation styles, I think. But I'll just go through this one first. The first stage is context. Again, it's the background, it's the current events, it's the context, the environmental context, the research context. Like, what are you addressing? What are you building from? This is your foundation. Then research questions, 1 to 3 bullet points, just saying what the problems are, what you're trying to find out. And then you move on to the methods. I think this method section could be quite short, which again is the difference between the presentation. In the method section, you want to make it visually interesting and easy to follow. So I would suggest using a flow diagram. You do one thing, and after that you do a set analysis, and after that you do some kind of visualization or something. So a flow diagram is an easy way for people to consume a method. As they tend to be asked the most technically challenging, you need to make it the most effectively commutative as you can. Then, of course, going to the results. Like in orals, where I say try and show what insights you made, perhaps add anecdotes. Here, again, bullet points, or maybe just one key figure to underscore, and then this should lead into the key highlight section. Again, 1 to 3 take-home messages you want them to know. And then at the bottom, much smaller text than the rest of the poster, put your citations and your acknowledgements. A key point I was touching on before is also to make it flow. So graphics tend to communicate much more effectively over text. So again, by graphics, I mean things like infographics. I mean things like figures. I mean things like a photo. Don't use tables. Tables rarely work, I find. It takes longer for people to intuitively understand what the data is telling them without a visualization. And it also increases the reading time. So this also works for presentations as well, I think. If you put a table, people need take time to read through it. If you put a figure up, if you put an infographic up, then people can take time to process that, but it tends to be much quicker. A few other points, use titles, headers, and negative space to divide your poster. So I'll go into what negative space is before, but guide people along with labeling each section. And also use a hierarchy of different font and image sizes to direct your reader. People tend to be attracted to the bigger text first, and then will read the smaller text after. You can use that to structure your flow. I'll go to that soon as well. But what do I mean by negative space? I mean all the blank white stuff around here. It helps as a natural divider between sections. It also helps as places for the eye to rest. And that's important because if there's a lot of text, a lot of content all put together, then that can be very overwhelming. So negative space softens it and makes it easier to read. It can also be used for emphasis. The font is smaller, the negative space is much bigger, but it makes you focus a lot more on what is here. Also, it can also add emphasis not to just what you're writing about, but also what you're talking about. Using an empty space right now means you have nothing else to focus on but my voice. So during a oral presentation, for example, if you really want people to listen to something you're saying, include a blank slide, everyone's eyes will turn to you and can really kind of take advantage of that. But what do I mean about the hierarchy? This is a quick, super scientific poster I knocked up. And I'll just describe what I mean by that through a demonstration. So what is the first thing you probably notice? Well, it probably is the picture of the duck, right? It's a bit novel, a bit unique compared to the rest of the poster. It has some bright colors, it's yellow, it's cute. After that, your eyes probably went to the title. Large text, with some color highlights in the background. And then where else does it go? Well, it probably goes down to the second biggest text, which is the headers here. So you've got the introduction, and then there's content. And then it's the methods, and it's the content. And your eye has been directed by the composition of the poster to move around in this kind of flow, right? Attention-grabbing graphic, in this case it's a photo, going through the title, down to introduction, and into methods. Note that I'm also doing a top-down perspective for the writing content because most people read top-down, or at least as a European. If I continued this poster, maybe I'd still go further down to keep that top-down flow, or I might continue to the right of the image, make the image a really big center point for the poster, and make sure that it's not just top-down now, it's also left to right, which again is what a lot of people read here in Europe. So think about the flow you want to go in, the structure of your poster, and think how you can emphasize that using images, using header size and color, etc., and negative space. Again, no negative space between the sections to give emphasis. When it comes to posters, I think a lot of people hope the scientific subject or content is going to be so interesting enough that people will stop. And sure, that's definitely part of it. But research suggests the number one reason why people stay are the visuals. So it is a really key, important part to consider when you're designing your posters. Don't just throw text on. Don't just throw on your research hoping it's interesting enough. The visuals are there to emphasize that and make it more interesting. So this is an example of one poster design. There's many different ways to do a poster. This one was based on an idea by Mike Morrison, and the template is actually by Fabio Cremeri. And what you'll find is it makes use of a lot of the techniques I just mentioned. So the main finding is front and center. This is the key message, and it's the biggest text. So what do you want people to leave with is right here. And then it's emphasized by a lot of negative space. And that negative space is also a different color as well. So emphasis through color and negativity, or negative space, let's say. Negativity sounds a bit not so great. We have a QR code to lead to further research. Perhaps that's to the poster, perhaps that's to a paper. It could also be your website or contact information. And you notice he's organized it slightly differently. We start with a title and introduction. Notice the introduction is just bullet points. Same with the methods, but the methods are numbered to show progression and flow. Results section, one key figure. You don't want lots of figures, lots of graphics. Do you really need 3 figures to communicate one thing? Can you challenge yourself to actually communicate as a key point through one figure rather than using 3? Again, everything is bullet points. Any extra figures to add to your point on the side. So this is one way to do it. I think it's quite a good way. There are other ways. For example, you might even think about turning your whole poster into an infographic. I saw one by NASA, which showed the trail of a rocket as it lifted off, going across the poster. And then the research kind of flow followed that rocket trail. And each part of the poster, each section kind of showed how that contributed to the rocket. And it was a nice visual way to tell a story of like how this research contributed to this rocket and the equipment on the rocket they're using. A quick note on virtual presentations. So firstly, again, simplify even more. Less text, bigger graphics, especially if you're doing a poster online. Screens are smaller. There's less chance for people to see details. If you are presenting online, I sort of suggest a live demonstration. Again, ask organizers first. But if you're trying to show a method, a tool, or some kind of outcome, then you might be able to even play a video, for example. Just go off your presentation and play that. But please make sure your desktop is professional and clean. You don't need all the video games you're playing available for people to see and scrutinize. Also, when you're doing an online presentation, be aware of what it might look like for people in person. If it's a hybrid presentation, if using Zoom, for example, there's usually a video box in the top right corner. There's usually a menu item at the bottom. You can see it's blocking away some of the words here. So try and keep that in mind. For example, the EGU General Assembly uses Zoom. And so this is quite a common issue people run into. So for example, earlier I said you might want to include your email in a slide, perhaps include it at the bottom right rather than the top, where it could be covered by a video box. Final section, almost done. Design and graphics. As I said, graphics are much more quicker and effective at communication. Don't just use a figure from a publication. Instead, simplify it, use less labels, perhaps use one caption at the bottom to convey the relevance, and that's it. Use scientific scales. People still forget to do their scales on their posters, even senior scientists. So make sure we know what you're talking about in your figures. And don't use a rainbow scale. Each color should mean something. Maybe it's one spectrum, one color over a spectrum, or two different hues. But a rainbow scale is a lot of different colors. You've got, I don't know, yellow in the middle, blue one side, red the other. What do these mean? There's such a scattering, it doesn't really convey the science. So make sure you use a scale that complements the research rather than distracts from it. Again, keep it clean and simple. Avoid using too many labels, just the key things you need to do. Figures and papers are very information dense. You want to have the opposite in a poster. And always make sure it's there to make a point. Don't use a figure to just because you think it looks nice, like, is it there for a purpose? And again, avoid using a graphic as a background. This could be a photo, for example. There are different colors, different designs, etc. It removes negative space. It distracts from the text on top, for example. But I have seen it used effectively in some cases. So all of these rules, I say, generally are pretty good, but to know what you're doing, you can usually find a way to break them in a way that's really interesting and can actually work. So I'd suggest keep an eye out for how these are done. The infographic I mentioned about the rocket ship going up, that is pretty much using a huge graphic across the whole of a poster as a way to emphasize your points in a really good way. Color, I just hated on the rainbow last slide. I'm going to continue again this slide. Choose 3 colors. And when you include shades, that's like 5, right? So for this presentation, I chose a dark blue, a light blue, one to highlight. I also choose a kind of a yellow gold color. This is complementary to blue, so it adds a nice piece of emphasis. And then I got a black text color and a white text color, and that's it. That's my 5 colors. So if you do too many, it means that you lack consistency. You also lose the messaging as well, right? So you should have, for example, every header should be the same color to communicate to someone, this is the header. And when you have different sections, make sure they're highlighted in the same color as well, saying this is what a section looks like. All your color has messaging as well. And think about the color theory as well. We want to contrast, for example, so a dark text on top of a light background is good. But if I did, for example, a white text and a white background, we won't see it. But a white text and a black background, you will. That's a very extreme example, but also works with other colors as well. Complementary colors like yellow and blue work really well to kind of add that emphasis, but beware of clashes. If I chose purple instead, that'd be much more of a striking clash and be make it actually difficult to read rather than actually complementing what I'm trying to say. That comes down to the final point about keeping it accessible. Again, people with visual impairments need to be able to read what you're saying. People are colorblind. So go online and check out what colorblind friendly palettes there are. Media, so these are photos, these are videos. Do you have rights to media, or they have a Creative Commons license? I think there's some research that suggested a third of all media in scientific papers, not papers, sorry, presentations and posters were not Creative Commons and were not cited as they should have. So make sure they're Creative Commons, look for open access image repositories. If of photos of people, make sure you have their permission to show them. Make sure you keep it at high resolution. If you're printing a poster, make sure any photos are about 300 ppi. It can be it can get away with a bit less in PowerPoint presentations, but I don't want to risk it really. And again, print in CYMK, that's the color mode, which means when you design a poster or presentation, try and make sure the colors are CYMK as well, because then you have a much better idea of what it'll look like when it's done. Highlight few sides, we have the text. Use as little text as possible, use bullet points instead of paragraphs, but use full sentences. When doing text, use a sans serif font. Serifs are the little, I suppose, typographic features. The geoscience is coming out on the fonts like this. It makes it a bit harder to read, especially from a distance. So use a sans serif font, which is much more cleaner. You might also want to increase the gaps between words and lines to help readers. You see here, the gaps are wider, but here it's more narrow. And this makes it much more of a comfortable reading experience. We want to make it easy for people to read. And finally, don't try and squash text into your paper or presentation. Filling up the text and decreasing spaces just to include as much information as possible is going against what you want to do as a communicator. A final few things. When you're emphasizing, it's difficult to see underlined words from a distance, and also all caps are more difficult to read. So instead, use emphasis using bold or italics. And also, especially with posters, be aware that people are reading you from a distance. So always check if your poster is legible from about 2 meters or 5 feet away. The way you can do this, there's not a consistent style across scientific papers, but generally for body text. And this is also for oral presentations, for slides, 24 point minimum for that. And go a bit bigger for header and finally the title. Always realize you're presenting for the back of the row, the back of the room, right? Jargon. So what do I mean by this? Terms have multiple meanings. Some terms have one meaning in one field and another. Some terms have one meaning to scientists and to non-scientists. Watch out for niche terms to your fields. And be aware that people enter science from different paths. Some people maybe just do straight engineering. For me, I started off doing more humanities, looking at social geography, but my PhD is in fluid dynamics. So I went a slightly different path to a lot of other people. That means, for example, some terms you might be familiar with, others might not be. So trying to avoid jargon as much as possible. Some exceptions being that jargon also helps you to be precise. So just be sure you gauge your audience appropriately before you start using any. Acronyms, I avoid them as much as possible. More acronyms there are, more people have to remember them. And especially when using slides. In a paper, for example, you can include an acronym, and if you forget it, you can go back. But in a slide, you can go back to that previous slide because you're not in charge of the presentation as an audience member. So avoid acronyms, especially when you're presenting orally. And if you're not sure, the audience will know, just define that concept. Trying to do perhaps 1-2 definitions max per presentation. You don't want to waste time on it. But if it's important, do a quick definition. I'm sure people will appreciate, even if it's just a reminder. The final section before you present, and this is just the final run around. Before I present, check the dimensions. Is it a landscape or portrait poster? How big can you go? Check the upload dates. For the EGU General Assembly, you have to upload 24 hours in advance. After that, it's too late. So make sure you know when the deadline is for uploading your poster or presentation. In person, I always suggest visit the room you're presenting in first, especially when it's quiet. Get on stage, get a feel for it. You'll be more comfortable. You'll also know where it is, so you don't have to panic about trying to find that room. Virtually, always use a external mic or headset. We don't want the ambient or environmental noise coming in, hence why you should also find a quiet space. Check there's no light source behind you that stops from people seeing you and seeing how you talk and present. And make sure you're logged into your conference platform if that's necessary. For example, at EGU, if you're presenting virtually, you need to log into the website for the streaming links to appear on the program. If you're not logged in, you won't see that. And if you haven't done that and not sure what to do, that's more panic than you need, right? So make sure you know how to access those virtual links. A final few slides. Check the meeting's code of conduct. Most meetings like EGU have a behavioral guide, but if someone's inappropriate, that means you can use that to report them or complain to someone. Also, let people know if they can take pictures. Maybe something is too early, so sharing isn't permitted, then tell them that. The same, if you want to encourage people to share your research, then make sure you tell them that. So this is the end. There's a few resources. I talked about like accessing Creative Commons licensed images or open source images. EGU has one, it's called Imagio. It's full of videos and pictures, which you can use for free with attribution in your posters and in your presentations. Also, other communications, maybe in the paper. Accessible color palettes for people who are visually impaired and the colorblind. Fabio Cromeri has a really nice selection of scientific color maps, which are accessible to people who are visually impaired. So please check their website if you want to improve the accessibility to your figures, to your graphics, to your poster design. Also, people ask me, what do I use to design posters? You don't have to buy Adobe Illustrator. It's good, but there's other things out there. We have Canva, we have PowerPoint. I've seen people do some really interesting and good-looking things with PowerPoint. Affinity Designer, for example, or Vector if you want to try and creating your own icons, etc. If you're attending the General Assembly, the EGU General Assembly, there are a couple of more short courses you can attend to continue learning and training yourself. We have the Elevate Your Pitch, which I'm helping to run as well, which is about how do you generate your 1 minute, 5 minute pitch. And another one is Draw From In. So if you're interested in infographics, if you're interested in how to communicate through illustration, how to design a poster appropriately, color theory, etc., then check out the Communicating Research with Illustration course as well. And finally, if you are attending the EGU 25 General Assembly, know there is a video on our YouTube channel which has a guide for presenters as well, and that contains all the things you need to know in terms of preparing for your presentation. Also on our YouTube channel are other previous webinars, including on how to, for example, create effective and accessible graphics, which go into much more depth than I could do here. But yeah, that's the webinar today. We have some time for questions before I wrap up. I'll leave it on the resources, but meanwhile, I'll just go into the Q&A. Yeah, slides, if I can share them. So this recording will be on our YouTube channel. For people who want the slides, I suggest you contact me to me after, and I can share them. I'll just put my email in the chat here. Sorry, I'm presenting on my own, so I need to do all the little moderation bits as well. But here you go. So email projects@egu.eu if you want these slides. But this presentation will be uploaded onto the YouTube channel in a few weeks as well. There's no poster example on screen. I see, yeah, sharing slides, if we can do that. I see people discussing about simplification. Yeah, so what was said by another attendee is how do you simplify and things like that. It comes down to, for example, how can you say it? How much can you compress it, for example, before you attach an image to a slide? As I said, with online presentations, you can usually get away with low resolution images than for posters, for example. If there is a limit to the to what it can say. Sometimes I redraw my figures when I used to do research. If a figure is too complex, then I would try and take a snapshot of that, redraw it, Illustrator or something, and just kind of show the key hit of what that is. So look for compression, perhaps redrawing, see what also components, as was said by another attendee, could be making it more weighty. This might just be a case of going through, deleting certain rich content and seeing what works and what doesn't. Um, um, yeah, unfortunately, sometimes it's not an easier way around that. So sometimes it's really about like, okay, so this is an obstacle. Is there another way around this that I can find? If it's not through compression, if it's not through redrawing, if it's not through just finding out what is the element you can cut out, then is another way you can communicate that. Um, yeah, and that's pretty much most of the answers I have here. Um, I'd say that alongside everything else I mentioned, also just keep in mind a objective. Your objective might be to find collaborators, but usually it's about increasing your network for any kind of presentation. So you want to think of ways to emphasize that. I already said, including your email on oral presentation slides. This could also just be a QR code. Definitely bring uh, business cards, for example. Some people bring a smaller printout of their poster to put next to their poster, which I have two minds about. On one side, it's great that people can refer to your research after they left. But on the other side, sometimes people just come and pick up that paper and go and don't talk to you, because why would they? They have that poster now. So what I usually suggest is either just use business cards instead, or perhaps have a small business card with some of the highlights of the paper on it, perhaps. Um, and I think that's pretty much everything from me. Thank you for sticking with me. But as I said, but this information will be online. I'll include the resources in the description when this is posted online on YouTube. Contact me if you want the slides themselves. Otherwise, if you see me at the General Assembly, I'm happy to talk about communication, science communication stuff there too. So yeah, thank you everyone for attending and see you in the future.